Let me ask you something. Have you ever been stumped about how much you should give a guest speaker at your church? Are you curious about how much you should give a pastor for performing a wedding or a funeral service? Well, today we're cracking the code on honorariums. Whether you're a pastor trying to figure out how much you should receive, or you want to give a gift to a minister and you want to make sure you give the right amount, well, in this video, we've got you covered. Let's do this. Well, hey guys, I'm Thomas Costello here from REACHRIGHT. We do videos like these all the time here, so make sure you hit that subscribe button. Let us know in the comments if you have any questions or if you disagree with any of this stuff we're talking about here today. So let's start out with an obvious question. What exactly is an honorarium? Well, think of it as a gift, something you would give to a pastor or a minister as a token of appreciation to thank them for running a service, doing a wedding, or performing a funeral that you are a part of. Whatever that service they provide it is, the honorarium is a way to show respect and gratitude and really thank them for the time they invested and the effort they put into making your specific event special. Now, for me, as someone who's pastored for 15 years and has received many honorariums, one of the things I was taught from a very young age in ministry is that you should never set prices for services that you provide. Now, there's some exceptions to this rule, and if you're traveling as an itinerant minister and you speak at large conferences, you probably want to set your prices. But for things like weddings and funerals and maybe guest speaking locally, it would make sense just to rely on people's generosity in those cases. You'll see a very wide range of different numbers on this here. So most of this is anecdotal from my experience and from experiences of other pastors that I've talked to. I've done a pretty large sampling of a lot of my pastor friends and some of our clients here at REACHRIGHT. And these are kind of the averages of what we're hearing as fair compensation rates. So let's get to the first one. How much should you pay a pastor who comes in as a guest speaker at your church on a Sunday morning? Maybe they do 1 or 2 services there on a Sunday, and this is a tough one to figure out. It depends on a lot of factors. As a general rule, here's what we recommend for how you would calculate this. You would take your lead pastor, the one who normally preaches on Sunday mornings, and you would give your guest speaker somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of whatever that lead pastor's annual salary is there. So in this case, let's say you pay your lead pastor $50,000 a year. Well, 0.5% of $50,000 a year is $250. 1% would be $500. Now, how we came up with this is we kind of got to thinking about how much time and effort does it take to do a guest message. And in general, I think most pastors probably spend somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of their time preaching messages, preparing messages, praying about messages, and just getting ready to deliver a sermon. So if that's how much time a pastor spends in a given week, it would make sense with a 52-week year that somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of that total would be given. And this is nice because it'll typically raise the amount of the honorarium if it's at a larger church, because in general, larger churches pay lead pastors more money, and generally speaking, you can give a larger honorarium in those cases. So if your lead pastor makes $100,000 a year, an honorarium between $500 and $1,000 seems appropriate. If someone is traveling, they have expenses that go with that. It takes them more time, and it really is a big investment. So in those cases, I would call it 1 to 2% of your pastor's annual compensation. So just to use a round number, let's say you pay your pastor $100,000 a year total compensation. And if you're wondering how much do most pastors get paid, we actually did a whole video about that. I'll link to that up in the notes here on the top. $90,000 a year is the average that a pastor makes across the United States. For a round number though, let's use $100,000. So if someone comes from out of town, $1,000 to a $2,000 honorarium is a really reasonable amount. And that is on top of any travel expenses that you have to pay. Don't expect someone to fly across the country and book their own hotel for $1,000 honorarium because they're losing money on a deal like that. Try to be generous, and I think these are some good rough numbers to consider. Now, maybe you're wondering, how much should I pay someone to come and speak at my conference or my event? Well, this is a little bit different because that's more of a professional service. So in most of those cases, we would recommend asking the speaker what they customarily receive in those kinds of situations. And 9 times out of 10, they'll be happy to give you an amount and tell you what they expect to receive for that. And you can decide whether or not they're a fit for your event in that case. Now on to some of the more common ones that maybe you're wondering, how much should I pay my pastor for performing a wedding? There's lots of factors you need to consider when thinking about how much you should be giving a pastor for doing a wedding. One of them is, are they writing a sermon sermon just for you? Or are they using something more cookie cutter that they just put in your name? If they're writing a sermon, well, it takes some time to do those kinds of things. One of the things that people forget is that a wedding is not just that one day. In most cases, there's a meeting with the pastor ahead of time to plan the service. There's also the rehearsal that happens the night before. There's the wedding itself, which can take hours of time. So all in, pastors are usually dedicating somewhere between 4 and 8 hours of work into making your day special. You need to take all those factors into consideration when you're determining how much you give. But here's what we see generally is that most people will give an honorarium between $300 and $500 to the pastor who performs their wedding. On the low end, that would be maybe a pastor you don't have a lot of connection with, and maybe he or she isn't writing a sermon just for you in your ceremony. Maybe you don't have a rehearsal and it's a smaller event. The $300 might be appropriate in that kind of a situation. Now, if you're having a very large wedding with a rehearsal and several meetings before, $500 plus could be an appropriate honorarium for something like that. Be sure to take into consideration where you are in the country too for this. A pastor in Arkansas might have different expectations than a pastor in California, but you'll need to be the judge of that. But in general, I think an honorarium of $300 to $500 is a really generous gift that I think both sides will be happy with. Now, next, let's cover funerals. How much should you give a pastor who performs a funeral, a memorial service, or a wake? We'll use these terms interchangeably because the role of the pastor is generally speaking the same in all of these events. Well, like weddings, you need to consider some of the things that go into it. In most cases, the pastor is going to meet with the family before the memorial service. They'll plan out some of the things that we want to do and some of the elements with you. Next, you have to ask, are we going to do just a memorial service, or will there be an additional graveside service that the pastor has to be a part of? All of these things will factor into how much you should give your pastor as well as where you are in the country. But I'd say generally speaking, an honorarium of $200 to $300 is typically appropriate for a memorial service for a pastor. Most pastors will be very happy to receive something like that, and it helps you to feel generous and be a blessing to them. Finally, I want to talk about some of the questions that I've heard over the years that maybe you're wondering. Should I give a pastor an honorarium for this kind of an event? And let me cover a couple of those. For baptisms, no. You don't typically need to do any kind of an honorarium for a baptism, especially not for an adult baptism. In some traditions that have children's baptism and it's something that's formal and all the family is there, well, it might be nice to give some kind of a small stipend or even a gift card, but in general, no kind of an honorarium is expected for that. Same thing goes for confirmations, baby dedications, and first communions. In general, you don't need to give any kind of an honorarium for this, but if you feel compelled to give a small token of appreciation, feel free to do so. For things like hospital visits, home visits, for whatever the reason, generally speaking, there's no honorarium expected in these situations either. Pastors will always welcome some kind of a gift, but please don't feel like you're under any kind of obligation to give a gift to a pastor who comes and visits you in the hospital or in your home in your time of need. But I want to know what other questions you may have. Have you ever wondered, should I give an honorarium for this? Or maybe as I was talking about these numbers, you feel like, man, that is really out of whack with what I've seen. Let me know down in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think, and we'll get you next time.